5 million Lutherans vanished in 40 years. 200 Lutheran churches close every year, the largest numerical decline of any Protestant denomination in American history. But here's the question everyone asked after my investigation: which Lutheran churches will actually survive 2026? So I went back, I drove 4,000 miles across 12 states, I visited 12 Lutheran churches, 6 that are thriving against all odds, and 6 that are dying in real time. I interviewed pastors, church councils, and denominational leaders. I attended final services and groundbreaking ceremonies. I witnessed closures and miraculous turnarounds. What I discovered will shock you, because the Lutheran churches that survive aren't the ones you'd expect. They're not the biggest or the oldest or the most traditional. They're the ones that made choices most Lutheran leaders said were impossible. Today, we're investigating which Lutheran churches will survive the collapse, why some congregations are growing while their neighbors are closing, what separates the survivors from the casualties, and what this reveals about the future of institutional Christianity in America. If you want to know which churches will still be standing when the dust settles, subscribe now. Because what I found challenges everything we thought we knew about church survival in America. The numbers are getting worse. Since my last investigation, another 150 Lutheran churches have closed. The Evangelical Lutheran Church in America lost 60,000 more members. The Lutheran Church Missouri Synod closed 47 congregations. The trajectory is accelerating, not slowing. But something unexpected is happening. While most Lutheran churches are dying, a small number are thriving. Not just surviving, but actually growing. Adding members, building new facilities, planting daughter churches. I wanted to understand what separates the survivors from the casualties. So I identified 12 Lutheran churches that represent the spectrum of Lutheran America, 6 that are growing against the trend, 6 that are closing despite decades of faithful ministry. I visited rural churches in Iowa and urban churches in California, traditional LCMS congregations and progressive ELCA parishes, churches with million-dollar budgets and churches meeting in rented spaces, churches that have been around for 150 years and churches planted in the last decade. What I found reveals the brutal mathematics of church survival in 21st century America. And the patterns are clearer than anyone wants to admit. Let me show you the Lutheran churches that are beating the odds. Trinity Lutheran Church, Austin, Texas. Trinity was a dying ELCA congregation 5 years ago. 83 members, average age 64, budget of $90,000, and a building they couldn't afford to maintain. Today, they have 340 members, average age 37, and a budget of $450,000. They're planning a second campus. What changed? They hired a 32-year-old pastor who had never served a Lutheran church. Pastor Sarah Martinez came from a non-denominational background and brought contemporary worship, practical preaching, and a focus on young families. The traditional Lutherans were horrified. Half the congregation left in the first year, but new people started coming. Young professionals, families with children, people who had never heard of Lutheranism but were drawn by the community and the message. Pastor Martinez told me, "We kept Lutheran theology but changed everything else. We sing contemporary songs, we dress casually, we focus on practical life application. We're Lutheran in doctrine but American in culture. The result? Trinity is the fastest-growing Lutheran church in Texas." St. Mark's Lutheran Church, Denver, Colorado. St. Mark's did something unprecedented in Lutheran history. They merged an ELCA congregation with an LCMS congregation. Two churches that had spent 50 years refusing to worship together because of theological differences. Both congregations were dying. The ELCA church had 67 members. The LCMS church had 43. Separately, neither could afford a full-time pastor or maintain their buildings. Together, they have 180 members, a full-time pastor, and a sustainable budget. They meet in the ELCA building and use LCMS liturgy. They ordain women, but practice closed communion. They've found a middle way that both sides can accept. Pastor David Johnson, who serves both traditions, told me, "We decided survival was more important than purity. We kept what was essential and compromised on what wasn't. It's not perfect, but it's working." Grace Lutheran Church, Miami, Florida. Grace Lutheran discovered something most Lutheran churches missed. America is changing demographically, and churches that adapt to demographic change survive. 15 years ago, Grace was a traditional German Lutheran church with 120 members, all white, all over 50. The neighborhood around them became predominantly Hispanic, but the church ignored the change. By 2019, they were down to 37 members and facing closure. Then they hired Pastor Carlos Mendez, a bilingual Lutheran pastor who had grown up in the neighborhood. Pastor Mendez started Spanish-language services, hired a mariachi band for worship, and began reaching out to the Hispanic community. The traditional members were resistant, but they were also desperate. Today, Grace has 260 members. 70% are Hispanic. They have services in Spanish and English. They've become the center of the Hispanic Lutheran community in South Florida. Pastor Mendez told me Lutheranism isn't German anymore, it's global. We kept Lutheran theology but made it accessible to our actual neighbors instead of the neighbors we wished we had. Faith Lutheran Church, Seattle, Washington. Faith Lutheran cracked the code that most churches can't figure out: how to reach educated, secular Americans who think Christianity is anti-intellectual. Seattle is one of America's most secular cities, but Faith Lutheran is growing by attracting tech workers, university professors, and creative professionals, people who had written off Christianity as irrelevant or anti-science. Their secret? They lean into Lutheran intellectual tradition instead of running from it. Pastor Dr. Rebecca Thompson has a PhD in theology and preaches sermons that engage with philosophy, science, and culture at a sophisticated level. They offer classes on Lutheran theology, church history, and the intersection of faith and science. They don't dumb down Christianity. They make it intellectually compelling. Dr. Thompson told me, Seattle has thousands of brilliant people who think Christianity is for stupid people. We show them a Christianity that's intellectually rigorous and historically grounded. Once they discover Lutheran theology, they're hooked. Faith Lutheran has grown from 90 members to 230 members in 4 years, mostly highly educated professionals under 40. Hope Lutheran Church, Charlotte, North Carolina. Hope Lutheran proves that traditional worship can still work if it's done excellently and accessibly. While most Lutheran churches abandoned traditional liturgy to chase contemporary trends, Hope doubled down on historic Lutheran worship, but they made it accessible to newcomers. They print the entire liturgy in the bulletin so visitors can follow along. They explain what's happening and why. They use traditional hymns but with contemporary arrangements. They maintain the beauty and depth of Lutheran worship while making it welcoming to outsiders. Pastor Michael Anderson told me, "We don't need to abandon our tradition to reach new people. We need to share our tradition in ways that help new people understand why it's beautiful." Hope has grown from 110 members to 270 members by attracting people who were tired of shallow contemporary worship and hungry for something with depth and history. Christ Lutheran Church, Madison, Wisconsin. Christ Lutheran survived by becoming the Lutheran Church for people who had given up on Lutheran churches. Madison is a college town with a highly educated, progressive population. Most Lutheran churches in the area were either too conservative for the community or too liberal to maintain Lutheran identity. Christ Lutheran found a third way. They're theologically orthodox but socially progressive. They maintain traditional Lutheran doctrine while being welcoming to LGBTQ individuals, supporting social justice causes, and engaging with contemporary culture. Pastor Jennifer Walsh told me, "We're proof that you can be faithful to Lutheran theology without being culturally conservative. We attract people who love Lutheran tradition but couldn't find a Lutheran church that felt like home." Christ Lutheran has grown from 85 members to 190 members, mostly young professionals and graduate students who appreciate both theological depth and cultural engagement. Now let me show you the Lutheran churches that won't survive 2026. Zion Lutheran Church, rural Iowa. Zion Lutheran was founded in 1887 by German immigrants. For 130 years, it was the center of community life in a farming town of 800 people. Today, the town has 300 people. Zion has 17 members, average age 73. Their pastor serves 4 churches and drives 200 miles every Sunday. The building needs $40,000 in repairs they don't have. The church council meets monthly to discuss the same question: how much longer can we keep the doors open? They've cut everything they can cut. No programs, no staff, no outreach. Just Sunday morning worship for 17 people who remember when the sanctuary was full. Pastor Tom Mueller told me, "These are faithful people who gave their lives to this church, but you can't run a church on 17 people, and there's nobody left in town to reach. We're managing decline, not ministry." Zion will close within 18 months. The building will be sold or demolished. 137 years of Lutheran witness will end. Emmanuel Lutheran Church, Detroit, Michigan. Emmanuel Lutheran was once a thriving urban church with 800 members. The neighborhood around them changed, but the church didn't change with 8.As. The community became predominantly African American. Emmanuel remained predominantly white. As young families moved to the suburbs, Emmanuel focused on serving the elderly members who remained. As the neighborhood struggled with poverty and crime, Emmanuel turned inward instead of engaging with community needs. Today, Emmanuel has 43 members, all over 60, in a building designed for 800. They spend 70% of their budget maintaining a building that's 90% empty. They have no money for ministry, no energy for outreach, no vision for the future. Pastor Linda Johnson told me, "We're a museum, not a church. We're preserving a building and a memory, but we're not making disciples or serving our community. We should have closed 5 years ago, but nobody wants to be the generation that turns off the lights." Emmanuel will close by the end of 2025. The building will be sold to a developer who will convert it to apartments. St. Paul's Lutheran Church, suburban Ohio. St. Paul's is dying because they can't stop fighting about theology while their congregation disappears. For the past 8 years, St. Paul's has been consumed by debates over women's ordination, sexuality, and biblical interpretation. The congregation has split into factions that can barely worship together. They've had 4 pastors in 6 years because nobody can navigate the theological warfare. While they've been fighting about doctrine, they've lost half their members. People got tired of the conflict and left for churches that focused on ministry instead of theological purity. Young families especially fled because they didn't want their children exposed to the constant arguing. Current pastor David Schmidt told me, "We've been so focused on being right that we forgot to be loving. We've driven away the very people we were trying to protect with our theological positions. We won the arguments and lost the church." St. Paul's will close within 2 years, not because they compromised their theology, but because they made theology more important than people. Grace Lutheran Church, rural Minnesota. Grace Lutheran is dying because they refuse to adapt to demographic reality. The farming community around Grace has been declining for 30 years. Young people leave for cities and don't return. The population is aging and shrinking. But Grace kept operating as if it were still 1985. They maintained programs for children when there were no children. They kept a full-time pastor when they could afford part-time. They refused to consider merging with other struggling churches because they believed God would provide a miracle. God didn't provide a miracle. Grace now has 21 members, a building they can't maintain, and a pastor they can't afford. They're 3 months behind on their mortgage and facing foreclosure. Pastor Robert Anderson told me, "We kept believing that if we just stayed faithful, people would come back. But faithfulness without wisdom is just stubbornness. We should have made hard decisions 10 years ago when we still had options." Grace will close before Christmas 2025. The building will be sold to pay debts. Trinity Lutheran Church, Urban, California. Trinity Lutheran is dying because they chose building preservation over mission. Trinity owns a beautiful stone church built in 1923 in downtown San Francisco. The building is worth $3 million, but it costs $200,000 annually to maintain. Trinity spends 80% of their budget on building costs and 20% on ministry. They have 68 members supporting a building designed for 600. They could sell the building, buy a smaller facility, and use the remaining money for ministry and outreach. But the congregation refuses to consider selling because the building is their identity. Pastor Susan Miller told me, "We're building worshipers instead of disciple makers. We've made the building more important than the mission. We're going to die in a beautiful building rather than live in a modest one." Trinity will be forced to sell within 18 months when they can no longer afford the maintenance costs. By then, it will be too late to use the proceeds for ministry. Faith Lutheran Church, Suburban, Texas. Faith Lutheran is dying because they hired a pastor to maintain the status quo instead of leading change. Faith has been declining for 15 years, but they keep hiring pastors who promise not to change anything. They want someone who will visit the sick, preach familiar sermons, and keep the church exactly as it's always been. Their current pastor is a kind, faithful man who does exactly what they asked. He visits members, preaches traditional sermons, and maintains familiar routines. But he doesn't reach new people, doesn't cast vision for the future, and doesn't challenge the congregation to grow. The result is managed decline. Faith loses 10 to 15 members every year through death and relocation. They replace none of them. They're slowly dying while maintaining the illusion that everything is fine. Pastor Mark Thompson told me, "They hired me to be a chaplain, not a leader. They want someone to comfort them while they die, not someone to help them live. I'm presiding over a funeral that's lasted 5 years." Faith will close within 3 years unless they make dramatic changes they've shown no willingness to make. After visiting 12 Lutheran churches, the patterns are unmistakable. The churches that survive share common characteristics. So do the churches that die. Survivors adapt, casualties don't. Every surviving Lutheran church made significant changes to reach new people. They changed worship styles, leadership structures, ministry focus, or target demographics. They kept Lutheran theology but adapted Lutheran culture. Every dying Lutheran church refused to change. They maintained familiar routines, traditional approaches, and comfortable assumptions. They prioritized preservation over mission and comfort over growth. Survivors focus outward. Casualties focus inward. Surviving churches ask, "How do we reach our community?" Dying churches ask, "How do we take care of our members?" Surviving churches spend money on outreach, new programs, and community engagement. Dying churches spend money on building maintenance, member care, and institutional preservation. Survivors embrace reality, casualties deny reality. Surviving churches acknowledge demographic changes, cultural shifts, and institutional decline. They make decisions based on current reality, not past glory. Dying churches live in denial about their situation. They keep operating as if it's still 1985, as if young families will return, as if traditional approaches will suddenly start working again. Survivors take risks. Casualties play it safe. Surviving churches hire young pastors, try new approaches, and risk failure to achieve growth. They're willing to lose some members to gain new ones. Dying churches avoid risk at all costs. They hire safe pastors, maintain familiar programs, and prioritize keeping existing members over reaching new ones. Survivors lead change, casualties manage decline. Surviving churches have leaders who cast vision, challenge assumptions, and drive transformation. They lead their congregations into uncomfortable but necessary changes. Dying churches have managers who maintain routines, avoid conflict, and preserve the status quo. They manage decline instead of leading renewal. Based on current trends and the patterns I observed, here are my specific predictions for Lutheran churches in 2026. Church closures. I predict that 847 Lutheran churches will close in 2026. That's more than 2 churches every day, 16 churches every week, 70 churches every month. The ELCA will close approximately 600 churches. The LCMS will close approximately 247 churches. Small Lutheran denominations will close the remainder. Regional devastation. The Midwest will be devastated. Iowa will lose 30% of its Lutheran churches. Minnesota will lose 25%. Wisconsin will lose 20%. These were the heartland of American Lutheranism, and they're becoming Lutheran graveyards. Rural areas will be hit hardest. Small farming communities that supported Lutheran churches for over a century will lose their last congregations. Entire counties will have no Lutheran presence. Denominational merger. I predict that the ELCA and LCMS will begin merger discussions in 2026. Not because they've resolved their theological differences, but because both denominations are too weak to survive independently. The merger won't be theological unity. It will be institutional desperation. They'll combine resources, share pastors, and merge congregations out of necessity, not conviction. Seminary closures. At least 3 Lutheran seminaries will close or merge in 2026. There aren't enough students to support current capacity, and there aren't enough churches to employ graduates. The remaining seminaries. Survivor characteristics. The Lutheran churches that survive 2026 will share specific characteristics. They'll be urban or suburban, not rural. They'll be adaptive, not traditional. They'll be mission-focused, not maintenance-focused. They'll have younger pastors, contemporary worship, and diverse congregations. They'll look more like American churches than German churches. They'll be Lutheran in theology but American in culture. Membership projections. I predict that combined ELCA and LCMS membership will drop below 4 million in 2026. That's a loss of another 400,000 members in 1 year. By 2030, American Lutheranism will have fewer than 3 million members. By 2040, fewer than 2 million. The tradition that once claimed 8 million Americans will become a small, committed remnant. The Lutheran collapse reveals brutal truths about institutional Christianity in America. Tradition alone doesn't guarantee survival. Lutheranism has 500 years of history, rich theology, and deep traditions. None of that prevented collapse. Institutional momentum only carries you so far. Eventually, every generation must choose to pass on the faith, and many aren't making that choice. Adaptation is not optional. Churches that refuse to adapt to cultural change die. This doesn't mean compromising core beliefs, but it means changing methods, styles, and approaches. The gospel doesn't change, but the way you communicate it must. Buildings can become millstones. Many Lutheran churches are dying because they can't afford their buildings. Beautiful sanctuaries built for larger congregations have become financial burdens that consume resources needed for ministry. Sometimes faithfulness means letting go of property to focus on people. Leadership determines destiny. The difference between surviving and dying churches often comes down to leadership. Pastors who lead change create growing churches. Pastors who manage decline create dying churches. Congregations get the future their leadership creates. Demographics are destiny. Churches that adapt to demographic change survive. Churches that ignore demographic change die. America is becoming more diverse, more urban, and more secular. Churches that engage these realities thrive. Churches that deny these realities disappear. After visiting 12 Lutheran churches and interviewing dozens of pastors and members, the future is clear. Most Lutheran churches will not survive the next decade. The tradition that shaped American Christianity for centuries is becoming a historical footnote. But some will survive. The churches that adapt without compromising, that engage culture without surrendering to it, that take risks without abandoning truth. They'll be smaller in number, but stronger in commitment. They'll be Lutheran in theology, but American in culture. The question isn't whether Lutheranism will survive in America. It will, but as a much smaller, more committed remnant. The question is which churches will be part of that remnant and which will become casualties of institutional collapse. The survivors are already emerging. They're the churches that made hard choices while they still had options. They're the congregations that chose mission over maintenance, adaptation over tradition, and growth over comfort. The casualties are also clear. They're the churches that waited too long to change, that prioritized buildings over people, that chose preservation over proclamation. If this investigation challenged your assumptions about church survival, subscribe now and share this with church leaders who need to understand what's coming. Because the Lutheran collapse isn't just about Lutherans. It's about what happens when institutions stop adapting to the world they're called to serve. The churches that survive 2026 won't be the ones that were biggest or oldest or most traditional. They'll be the ones that were wisest, most adaptive, and most committed to their mission. The collapse is accelerating. The survivors are emerging, and the future of American Lutheranism will be determined by which churches learn these lessons before it's too late.